publish this. It's an experiment, and so we have no format and we have no like opening spiel or way to like traditional way to open this podcast. So that's why we're just opening like this.
That's a good way to open it. We might just delete it afterwards.
Yeah.
It'll be just a fever dream of a podcast.
We don't even have a name for the podcast, actually. That's where we're at.
Yeah.
But I'm Leighton Woodhouse, and you are
Fang.
Right.
Both half Asian Substackers.
Both in the Bay Area.
Yeah.
Both semi-voluntarily in the Bay Area.
And heterodox, meaning we're politically homeless.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Have a left-wing background, but are also pretty disgusted with many aspects of the left.
Right. So since this is going to our respective podcasts, Substacks, people probably already know all of this about us. But should we get into it?
Let's talk about the election. I mean, it's kind of crazy. I feel like I've covered every election of my adult life. And even, when I was a teenager, that's how I kind of got into writing, getting obsessed with elections. And this one's tough to get into. Like, it got minorly interesting for the first time when they couped Biden, or, he stepped down or whatever. We don't have to get into that. But, like, that was like a blip of interest. And now it's like, I'm struggling. I'm not saying it's not an important election. It's just, the big announcement this week from Kamala to try to rev up her campaign, or to at least stop the bleeding of losing support from especially black men, is this giveaway. I'm calling it that. I don't know. I would like to hear what you think about it, but it's $1 million loans that are forgivable to black entrepreneurs to start businesses. That's $20,000. Sounds a little bit like PPP, but racialized, only for black entrepreneurs. Supporting a regulatory framework for cryptocurrency and digital assets to black men who invest in and own these assets so that they're protected. It's such a mealy-mouthed way to say we're promoting crypto for black people. And then this national health equity focused on black men, for diabetes and mental health, prostate cancer. I don't know why this is racial. Like, a lot of men have these issues. The equity thing is like kind of a dog whistle to both sides to get upset, I think.
Did you mention the weed thing?
And then the last thing is the weed thing. There's another one, supporting education, training, mentorship. Okay, sure.
Whatever. And
then legalizing recreational marijuana and creating opportunities for black Americans to succeed in this new industry.
Seems vaguely racist, although I can't tell you exactly why.
It sounds super racist, but it does follow this framework where there's a narrative around marijuana decrim, legalization, commercialization, that because black people were associated with the underground black market trade for so long,
they're like, they're good at it. They're good at weed dealing.
Yeah, so that there should be a priority for them to open up dispensaries and benefit from commercial businesses.
I do understand. To give it the benefit of the doubt, I do understand it on one level, because I remember reading this piece a while back about legalization in Colorado, and how there'd been all these arrests of black men for illegal marijuana distribution and sales pre-legalization. Then they legalized it, and like the entire industry was just taken over by like white yuppies. And so in in Oakland, where I live, which is like sort of become one of maybe the hub in California for the legal cannabis industry, they very self-consciously were trying to shape the industry in a way that did not mimic what happened with Colorado because of that racial exclusion. So this is me giving the benefit of the doubt. This thing, as you know, I'm where we differ on this. I'm opposed to the legal cannabis industry altogether.
Right.
But
I've come over. You've actually convinced me a little bit on this.
Really?
I've written in favor of decriminalization and legalization for a long time, and I've won. We're here. Like the presidential candidates are talking about this. Trump's basically for it too. He just doesn't campaign on it quite as much as Kamala. Um, there's clearly a problem with the high potency weed shatter, um,
Hmm.
the hyper concentrated stuff. Um, sure. So I mean, I don't want to, I'm not rolling back. I don't want any criminalization, but there needs to be
Yeah, and
federal
to be
standards
clear,
on labeling, on the
hmm
amounts. I mean, some of the stuff's not even marijuana. It feels like if it's that strong, it almost becomes
yeah,
another drug. I'm not
agree.
sure about that. Maybe chemically it's all the same, but
Yeah.
I don't know.
And I should say that I'm not against decriminalization. I'm totally in favor of decriminalization. I am against legalization, and there is a big difference. It's not even a subtle difference. It's a very big difference because legalization allows corporations to get into it.
Well,
Um,
okay, but about the just before we get off of this, about the
yeah.
racial thing, like I think it's one of those things that it sounds like it has a justice angle, so it's appealing. There was a historic wrong. I mean, it's kind of crazy that so many people who use drugs, you know, had very few criminal penalties, and people who, engaged in the sale and distribution, very harsh criminal penalties. That is an injustice in many respects. There are some crazy dynamics around that historically, but it's like one of those things where, okay, you said white yuppies
Mhm.
are starting dispensaries in Colorado. Who cares who they are? I don't
Yeah.
know. Like, I feel like if there are people who are directly impacted by these injustice in the past, then let's just fix those. Let's not create a whole new racial category to hopefully like like if you were actually harmed by something in the past and you've reformed and you've gone through the process, sure, but just assuming that all black people, or all X people, it doesn't really matter what the
Yeah.
race is, should receive this new benefit because of something that happened in the past. It doesn't
Yeah.
really fit together, right? Like it's just true for the other kind of affirmative action programs where we've seen, like, the children of Ghanaian or Nigerian immigrants receive preferential treatment to Princeton or Harvard to somehow ameliorate for the sins of the U.S. in the past and the people who are actually the descendants of folks who were harmed by slavery or Jim Crow
Yeah.
won't actually end up benefiting. Like, let's actually connect the programs to the harm, not just make these broad racial categories. It never makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you in principle. I was just kind of given the best case for the other side. The article, I think, was by Amanda Chicago, I think is the name of the reporter. She's a pretty good weed reporter, and I think it was in BuzzFeed, and it was like 4 or 5 years ago. So people can read that if they want to see the case for it. But yeah, I don't agree with the racialized stuff. Obviously, we're on the same page about that. I would just acknowledge that the way that it played out in Colorado does seem as if there were some inequities to it, but
Yeah.
whatever. I'm opposed to legalization in the first place. Ironically, actually, if they just decriminalized and didn't legalize, they wouldn't have had this problem because the people who were criminally distributing marijuana could continue to do so and not be arrested for it, and
Yeah.
that would be the same black market actors who are, by almost by definition poor or working class, that it was when it was illegal. But anyway, not to go too far down this rabbit hole around just returning to the election. I mean, first of all, I don't know if I even would agree with the statement that this election is particularly important.
Mm.
Certainly, if Kamala is elected, it won't be important at all. I mean, every election is important. Every presidential election is important. But if Kamala is elected, this will just be a return. There'll be like a kind of a subtle return of the Democratic Party to a former iteration, maybe a little bit more neoliberal of a direction, and that will be significant in some respect, but not in a grand historical way. And if Trump wins, then it'll be a return to the Trump years. And if the liberals are right and that he becomes a dictator, then obviously it will. I'll eat my words, and this will be a very consequential election. But if barring that fantasy, I don't even know if I agree that this is an important election at all. And the other thing I'd say is that neither of these candidates. I mean, the thing that feels really apparent to me and kind of empty to me about this election is that it's not just that I despise both candidates. It's that neither candidate deserves to win.
Mm.
Like, at least with, like, I despised Hillary Clinton too,
Yeah.
but she deserved to win the presidency. Like she deserved more than anybody I can think of in terms of just having put in the years, achieved the expertise, built the resume, was a serious candidate, had an actual serious platform. You know, you can agree with it, disagree with it, but it was like she had her policy specifics were there. She had a vision for the presidency. This is just like, I mean, there's Trump just seems just ego driven and just like this is just a personal saga for him. It's just about like revenge and redemption, and then and then Kamala is just
Anti-Trump.
like yeah she was just like shoehorned into this position without having campaigned at all. I mean, she certainly obviously don't even need to elaborate on this, doesn't deserve it. It just feels like so arbitrary, these two candidates.
Yeah, I mean, I actually no disagreement there. It's just, well, maybe a little bit disagreement, but I agree in the broad strokes. It's also the big policy distinctions. It felt like 2012 had huge policy distinctions between Obama and Mitt Romney. There was a Tea Party Congress that wanted to repeal everything, including the Affordable Care Act. There's Paul Ryan on the ticket that wanted to fundamentally reshape Social Security and Medicare. I mean, that's how a third of this country gets by, almost. And now it's like on entitlements, Trump, Kamala, they're not at least fighting over it. Maybe there's some differences, but they're not talking about it. Trump's not even talking about repealing the big Biden programs, and he's given up on the Affordable Care Act. So that's now finally in the dustbin of history. It's just maybe tweaking some of the regulations. And there's really no big proposal from either of them. Like it's small ball stuff. It's weed for black people, or no tips for workers. Which I don't know. I feel like that's one of those things where it sounds nice. It's good populism, but it's probably bad policy.
Yeah, I'll get into that because I've been. At first, I thought it would sound great. I used to be a waiter, as probably most people were at some point in their lives. No, and declaring I mean, it was such a joke. You declare 50% of your earnings, and so you'd only pay 50%, like the tax on 50% of your tip earnings. That was just standard in the industry. But now, like I listened to this episode of The Daily. This isn't my original analysis or thinking or anything, but they pointed out that like if you have no taxes on tips, then it's just going to incline more and more employers to shift to a tip-based compensation model just in order to compete, right? Like in order to compete for workers, if you're going up against a job where you're not paying taxes on most of your earnings, or you are paying taxes on most of your earnings, then employers who are where you're relying on tips are going to be at an advantage, which means that like we've already seen this huge progression towards tipping on everything. You go to the grocery store and you're in the self checkout aisle and it asks if you want to tip, right? And that's mostly because of technology. But now and COVID a little bit. But it's just gonna be much more of that. So if that stuff pisses you off, if it irritates you that you're being asked to tip on, buying a birthday card, expect much more of that, and expect to have to tip on every service.
I've seen a few kind of credible critiques that this will incentivize white collar work to start adding tipping. Go like doctors and financial advisors and other kind of high income, highly educated jobs to why not to change their fee model into tips. Right. So it's bad for the consumer because there's just we already have a lot of opaque issues around fee arrangements for all kinds of these kinds of accounting and legal fees and what have you. Doctors' fees. I mean, can you imagine in the hospital the tipping little window? And then of course it's a huge problem for just tax evasion. Like you're just going to convert a big part of what should be taxable income into non-taxable income. It's stupid.
So on the one big issue that they agree on is just bad policy. Also, just inherently bad policy. And then the latest thing has been this as you mentioned, this hemorrhaging of especially black male voters from the Democratic side. which is worth pausing on and talking about. I might write a story about it. Actually, I interviewed a black Trump supporter in Oakland yesterday. Well, I should say he lived in Oakland, now lives in Fairfield, but he works in Oakland still as a longshoreman. And he was saying that, so he grew up, he grew up relatively apathetic, but a Democrat, and was very very enthusiastic about Obama during his first run, and is now like just 1,000% Trump. Considers himself a conservative. Considers the Democratic Party.
Why? What's his motivation there?
So, I was trying to get at that, and I mean, the biggest thing that punched out was just that he feels abandoned and betrayed by the Democratic Party. I would say that there's the negative factor has been sort of a push factor more than like the GOP being a draw. But the way he described it was he was like, so this guy was I think he was born in '69. So he was like coming on the tail end of the civil rights movement. He was like, these guys, these leaders, Jesse Jackson, Andrew Young, all these people were like at that when he was a kid, people just assumed these guys have our best interests at heart, and who they're building on this incredible movement we just came out of, and so they kind of trusted them with their political strategizing and would vote in lockstep with whoever they endorsed and whoever they called for them to vote for. And it was just an erosion of many, many years of seeing how this civil rights establishment, this is his description, not mine, about how the civil rights establishment became more and more corrupt and self-serving, and so he just eventually felt used and betrayed, and Obama was a huge disappointment to him. And then the other stuff he was talking about that made him more conservative was just kind of stuff that happens when you get older and more stable. I mean, he's a homeowner. He doesn't want to pay huge taxes on that stuff. He thinks that the Democrats steal your tax money to pay for just absolutely preposterous social programs that don't benefit anybody, which is, in my opinion, a defensible opinion. But a lot of that is just like, now he makes probably, I think he said he makes 150,000 a year, which is not the top rate. He's made more in the past, but he's got with a high school degree. He said he barely made it out of high school.
And he's still in Oakland.
He's still in Oakland. He's still working as a longshoreman in Oakland. He moved to Fairfield, so he's living in the exurbs, but he still works in Oakland and grew up in Berkeley and Oakland. And I realized when he was telling me, I was like, I think he overlapped with Kamala in Berkeley.
Yeah, especially at that age,
yeah,
around the same time.
Yeah, so now it's like, I mean, this has been a long time coming. I've written about it quite a bit. Rui Teixeira has written about it exhaustively, about the decline in black support for Democrats, and now it feels like it's like the denial phase is over for the Democrats. It's just like they are coping with a reality that has been in the cards for a decade now, and now all of a sudden they've woken up to it.
Yeah, I mean, there's part of me that wants to say, well, duh, Democratic Party has condescended and looked down upon working class voters and their concerns for a very long time. Mm-hmm. As we've seen, like the last decade of young men declining, suicide rates, violent rates, depression, video game addiction, dropping out of college. There's just kind of, oh no, these you young men are abusers. There's absolutely no compassion or interest for them. The NGO complex, dominated by billionaires that kind of control the Democratic Party and shift it towards these very esoteric issues around land acknowledgements or defund the police that, again, completely either disconnected from working class interests or actively working against them. But then I want to kind of temper those thoughts that are constantly swirling in my head when I hear anecdotes like this, that this is happening everywhere, no matter how the center left operates. Like, I don't know if you've seen the data in Korea, that it's even more extreme here. Young men and the kind of divide with working class people and elites, just abandoning the equivalent of the Democratic Party there, the left, in droves. a version of this all throughout Western Europe, throughout
Yeah,
Southern
basically
Europe.
Brexit. Hmm.
And Brexit, yeah, definitely. And it's like, well, is this kind of on autopilot, or are there even decisions that the Democratic Party can make at this point that
Yeah,
reconnect them with working class voters and men?
yeah,
Those are the two big dynamics in this election. It's not just black men; it's Latino men, to some degree, Asian men.
yeah. Well, but my empirical question is like, how much can you parse the race stuff from the class stuff? Because, the story of white working class voters leaving the Democratic Party for the Republican Party is a story that goes back to the 70s, right? For as long as I've been alive, but especially the 90s and the turn of the 21st century. This has been with us for a long time. The case that Roy makes is that you had, this white working class primarily in sort of the post-industrial parts of the country, leaving the Democratic Party for many years, and now the black and Latino working class are leaving as well, not because they're black or Latino, but just because they're also the working class. And
Yeah,
I would say that the reason why um, blacks and Latinos have been delayed in that process that began with the white workers is also not about cultural or ethnicity, but probably more about urbanness, about like it's the working class sort of drift that took place in the red states, in the exurbs, in post-industrial places, has finally now reached like the city cores in the blue states.
yeah,
It's the same working class, but it's like the working class in the urban blue state areas tends to be much more multiracial. So now you're seeing this, many different colors of it. But so the fallacy was ever talking about this as the white working class exodus from the Republican Party, rather than just the working class exodus of the Republican Party, the advance guard of which happened to be white people.
right. It's just that everyone else is catching up with the white working class, but it's a
Right.
bigger paradigm.
Yeah. And I subscribe to that. I mean, I think, and in that sense, in that sense, I guess, is it a huge phenomenon, or is it just a logical realignment because the Democrats have become the party of big business, and the Republicans have not, in my view, become the party of the working class, but there are those who aspire to there's a faction within the Republicans pushing them in that direction. They've been paying lip service to it for a long time. So is this now just a realignment, just a natural flip where the working class people who used to be with the Democrats were with the Republicans, and the business interests that used to be with the Republicans were the Democrats?
Yeah, I don't know. I feel like this is such a policy-free election. It's kind of hard to test those questions. Like
Mm-hmm.
on policy, like Trump promising an even lower corporate tax rate, 15%. I mean, we're already at a very low rate, what, 25%, and it's like,
Mm-hmm.
all right, I don't know.
Yeah,
Maybe it'll juice the stock market even more. The stock market's doing really well.
yeah,
Uh, he's going to get rid of some of these business regulations. All right, maybe that'll downstream help some working class people. I think ultimately it's just the aesthetics are more appealing to working
totally.
class people. People know who run the Democratic Party. It seems like the HR party, the party of people who went to private school and went to fancy Ivy Leagues.
Right.
So it's kind of like this is lots of kind of coded language and visuals you see in both parties, kind of optics and aesthetics, and who they choose to be their leadership. It's like, all right, one resonates a little bit more than the other, but on policy, it's like there's nothing that dramatic that the Republicans are giving working class people or providing, at least in an economic sense. I mean,
Right.
certainly like guns skew a little bit more working class, or it's more rural, which is also coded more working class, but it's still not crystal clear to me that either party is really championing. We're just middle class. What are middle class interests? Like property
Childcare.
taxes? I don't know.
Mm.
Like prices are expensive, but neither side is really offering anything that exciting to bring down
Right.
costs. Like Trump's offering more tariffs that will probably make things more expensive. And um,
I mean, the other way to look at it is to is to, rather than see it in it's just a straight like capital labor divide, which is kind of an artifact of the 20th century, is, and I've looked at it this way in the past, that it's like you had globalization, and then you had a huge swath of the country with that was impoverished by NAFTA and by global free trade, and the disadvantaged workers drifted over to the Republican Party for a variety of reasons, but mostly drifted away from the Democratic Party, which was, championing globalization. The Republicans
I
were
mean,
too
both
at the
sides
time.
were
Yeah.
almost equally championing globalization.
Yes. Yes. But over time, it was like the bank bailouts were supported far more by Democrats than Republicans by the time that rolled around. So there was in the 90s, in the zero zeros. Yes, I think it was absolutely bipartisan. They called it the Washington Consensus, and the Republicans would campaign to those workers on cultural issues. But there was a drift away from the Democratic Party um, uh, with that Washington Consensus. And then there were other states that benefited immensely from globalization and from NAFTA. And those tend to be the blue states. It was like or at least the states
The
that
service sector, banking, tech, high tech.
absolutely, yeah, healthcare,
Yeah.
higher education, design, like these professional industries, and I should say industries that have a high professional sort of aspect to them, because healthcare obviously is mostly working class people, but it's also a high growth industry because of new technology and because of the medical instruments are now mostly produced in Tijuana across the border for way cheaper than they used to be. Like all these industries that really benefited from globalization, the Democrats have naturally come to represent that class, and so it's not just a working class employer split.
Right. Well,
It's sort of post-industrial, pre-industrial,
no, I think that's right. And it just feels like,
not
you wrote
post-industrial.
something that was really interesting around the renaissance of zombie TV shows and movies over the last 20 years. And I thought it was really good. People should check it
Thank you.
out. But the kind of summary of it, at least in my sense, is that it correlates almost perfectly with American optimism and American
Mhm.
exceptionalism, that when we were this boundless nation that was conquering the hemisphere or the globe, dominating the economy, fighting this global war on, Soviet despotism or whatever,
Mhm.
despotism, uh, we had this kind of sunny outlook. Now that we're kind of at the end of history, and there are maybe fun, interesting technological innovations, but people I think kind of expect them to go to the very rich, the very few. Most people have a dismal outlook. There's nothing left to really conquer for the regular person.
Mhm.
So now we're just kind of running through these um, kind of dark fantasies around how we're going to survive the
Mhm.
decay and downfall of this country. Even with, well, you can make the counter argument that GDP growth is high. American rebound after COVID was the best in the Western industrialized world. People don't feel it, and they still kind of glom onto this decay and downward spiral. And the kind of parallel for me is like, in terms of policy, the why Republicans have so well reinvented themselves, and they glom onto Trump not just because he's such a compelling and intimidating figure in their political party, is that he's offered them a very simple path.
Mhm.
There's nothing else to fight about on healthcare. There's nothing else to
Mhm.
fight about really on taxes, even though he's got this corporate tax rate cut. He's not really talking about it.
Mhm.
It's just immigration. Who do we
Right.
let in? It's who do we let in as we kind of decay or stagnate? If
Right.
the pie is not truly going to be shared more, or grow to such a degree that our lives can be so much better, how do we put a little fort around the pie? It's
Right.
and this election is not going to be the last one like this. It's going to be the next one and the next one and the next one. And as we get more AI and robots to replace who's picking our fields, who's working in these warehouses, who's driving these cars and vans and trucks, and there's less of an economic magnet for workers from Guatemala, then more of a reason to keep them out. I think
Yeah.
that's the politics of the future, and it's zombie-esque in the sense that we're just constantly thinking, hey, what we've got, we're not expecting to grow it. not
Yeah.
dramatically.
Right.
Just don't
Yeah.
want to share it.
The pie's not growing. The as I mentioned in that piece, I've been reading this book about westward expansion, and it just occurred to me the other day when I was reading the part about the Chinese immigration to the West, that like the arguments that were used to restrict Chinese immigration, which led to the Chinese Exclusion Act, were like virtually identical to the arguments that are being made now. Partly that's probably because those arguments were legitimate, like arguments like, this is
They're also eating the dogs and cats.
That's true. It was actually more accurate. I'm just kidding, but I say this because for the listeners, because Leah is obviously Chinese, and so that's a character flaw I have to make fun of at every opportunity because I'm Japanese, which is the superior of the East Asian races, as we know from history. But anyway, like all the arguments were like it was like moral decay. I mean, there was bringing down labor prices for white Americans, which is just a fact of bringing in immigrants. It's just economic reality. But then like pestilence, moral decay, weak character, this like this cultural division that it's creating, so that we don't have like a unified American culture anymore. All this stuff was just like it's like the same arguments trotted out, and I just found it deeply ironic because now Asians are constantly pointed to as Chinese in particular, but Chinese, Koreans, Japanese are pointed to as the model minority and the people who did it right, the people who came here and assimilated, and now they're professionals and they're very successful, and they're like the new white people, and like there's been obviously a lot of people talked about discrimination against Italians and against Irish people and how they were considered non-white, but Asians as well. It just felt like the exact same thing all over again. So I was like, okay, in 100 years, are Guatemalans and Salvadorans going to be considered this like model minority, that's like assimilated well, and we're going to be like shitting on Albanians moving here or something?
Yeah,
I don't know.
we will. I mean, the
It's
history just
cyclical.
always repeats itself.
Yeah.
I'm obsessed with these debates. I mean, I not that long ago, just a year or two, learned about when San Francisco had its own kind of quasi-communist mayor, Eugene Schmitz. He was a musician,
Hmm.
head of the musicians union, and after one of the big kind of waterfront strikes that was very violent at the turn of the century, where truly just kind of like a fight between labor and capital, where one thing led to the next, and all these organized labor groups mobilized for a joint strike, and it got very violent in San Francisco.
Hmm.
He the unions thrust him up as a candidate, and there was a new Labor Party that was neither Republican or Democrat, and it swept into office all the supervisor seats, which is basically the city council, and the mayorship. San Francisco went red, basically.
Hmm.
And his platform was, no open shops, meaning you had to hire union labor, no bringing scabs in. They wanted to municipalize, basically nationalize the water and the light rail, the trains that were in the city. Two goals that were eventually accomplished. That San Francisco has its Hetch Hetchy water and its muni public transit system.
Hmm.
And then his other thing was no Chinese. Our leftist, ultra socialist, quasi communist mayor,
Right.
Eugene Schmitz, big on
Yeah.
nationalization.
Oh,
Not so hot on Chinese.
the other thing that was so uncanny with the analogy with the Chinese today was that also the other big thing was opium dens. It was like the
Yeah.
Chinese are bringing in opium, and now,
Yeah.
of course, every stump speech that Trump mentions fentanyl, and fentanyl coming
Right.
across the border with the illegals. So yeah, I found that very deeply, deeply ironic and
I
kind of
mean,
just
for the Haitian thing, I think it's very similar to the Chinese issue as well. There's a broader kind of look you could have on the Chinese. I mean, there's a reason those labor unions in San Francisco were against them, and that the big employers, every time that workers asked for more pay, for better benefits, they would bring in shiploads of Chinese and Filipinos, sometimes actually eventually Japanese too, workers to break the strikes, to actually bring down the solidarity of workers. And so it was a weapon used against the American working class. So they were very I think, legitimate reasons for those union leaders to be pushing back against Chinese labor and Chinese immigration. It's just in terms of how this actually plays out politically, culturally, it takes a sharp turn and it becomes talk about, bringing in prostitution and drugs and changing the fundamental American culture, which, there's some aspects of that that are true, but a lot of it got obviously magnified, exaggerated, turned into kind of hateful, bigoted stuff. It's just so similar with the Haitian issue. Um, you have big employers. You have Tyson Foods. You have other slaughterhouses in the Midwest that run almost entirely on migrant labor. That people who've come in legally and illegally, but then are legalized basically retroactively with this temporary protected status and other kind of work permit status that's provided. Who lobbies for that? It's Tyson Foods, it's others, and there's a question of whether you can even find Americans to do these jobs. But other countries do it. In Australia, Denmark, they have much higher pay for slaughterhouse workers, and they use more domestic labor. They don't have this kind of permanent pool of foreign workers that we use in America to keep our meat cheap. But of course, we can't just talk about that. Of course, the politics then becomes this kind of bigoted, racist thing.
Right.
It's
I mean,
just like,
another thing to that I discern from reading that account of the history of the Chinese labor force in America is that, it pointed out that the Chinese Exclusion Act. So there, like, it was like the I think the ratio of men to women who came into the United States was like 250 to 1 or something. There were basically almost no women, almost entirely men, because they were coming to labor, and there were also traditions in China about the wife had to stay back to take care of the in-laws and honor the ancestors and stuff like that. So there's other stuff too, but there was, like, whatever the reasons, it was overwhelmingly men. And because these men didn't have wives and children to support, they were able to undercut white labor. And so, like, and so the Chinese Exclusion Act actually made it even worse, because there were already this Chinese labor force here. 40,000 more people rushed in from China, overwhelmingly men, in the 6 months before.
wait, you're telling me military-age men, Chinese men coming into our country?
Yeah. um, and and so then it made the problem even worse, because then it was like this permanent pool of, like, so it occurred to me that I was like, the Republicans complain about immigration, but they also complain about chain migration. And I was like, well, it does seem like if you have a Honduran working at a meat packing plant in Iowa, you're better off if that Honduran laborer has a wife and kids to raise, just in terms of the wages that they'll demand, than if they're unattached. And a huge part of our immigrant workforce in the United States, for a variety of reasons, but one of them is our immigration policies are seasonal workers who either seasonal workers or people who are planning to come here for 5 or 6 years and then move back, and not to raise a family in America. And that's partly because they're out of their own agency and their own decisions, and it's partly because we don't welcome those immigrants to become assimilated, and that's obvious to immigrants. And so, there's a confluence of reasons, but, like, I guess what I'm trying to point out is that chain migration might be the answer in terms of making wages more competitive and assimilating people.
Yeah, I mean, if you're trying to put food on the table for your kids and your wife, you're going to fight harder. I mean, it's human instinct.
You're just going to have to demand higher wages.
Yeah.
You're just going to have to. It's
Yeah.
just like, it's just inevitable.
Yeah, it seems obvious. Um, one other thing I wrote about a little bit about, I started writing about the San Francisco election. There's a big election in the East Bay, recall of the very, very left-wing prosecutor there, Pamela Price. Big kind of momentous election in San Francisco, potentially because of the moderates' control of the city council or the board of supervisors and the mayorship. Maybe there's going to be a big change. It's been 2 years where 2 years ago, we recalled our very left-wing prosecutor. Last year, got rid of some of these ultra-left Board of Education folks. Maybe the pattern continues. People seem very organized, but are you seeing anything interesting on your side of the bay in terms of the elections that are coming up?
Yeah, hell yeah. Um, yeah, I actually just went to a fundraiser the other day for LaRon Armstrong, who's the former OPD chief who was fired by the current mayor Sheng Tao, who's now running for city council member at large, and he was there as well as Brenda Harbin Forte, who led the recall effort against Sheng Tao and is running for city attorney. And their goal is to. I think there's 5 council seats up in the election in out of 8 in Oakland, and so they have a chance to actually achieve just a new city council majority in one election cycle, which is what they're trying to do, which is made more difficult by ranked choice voting, but that's another subject. But from what I've heard, I mean, my understanding is that Sheng Tao is done. Like it's like the polling. It's just there's like essentially no way that she's gonna win the recall.
I saw the numbers. I think it was East Bay Insider or one of these other kind of very good local Substacks. There's no money going in to protect her from the recall. Like she hasn't raised much. There's not much outside money. Maybe a little bit of union cash and a few folks who have been her longtime supporters. But yeah,
I think Quinn Delaney put in some money along with a union or two for an IE, right. But that's it.
But nothing big, and so they probably read the tea leaves that it's not looking so hot.
Yeah. Actually, ironically, I think the Pamela Price recall is much closer, and so that's much less in the bag. But Sheng Tao is essentially done. And then I don't know if you've been keeping up, to what degree you've been keeping up with the granular stuff around Oakland politics. But have you read about this Coliseum deal that they made?
Only broad strokes. I mean, it seems like a crisis. Like it just, I feel like, so there's part of me that's, Schadenfreude. It's like, okay, these city leaders suck. They are so high and mighty in terms of their ultra woke politics, but then they can't do the basics of governing. They forget to apply for federal crime money. They forget to put their own candidate statement in. They fuck up selling city assets. But then it's also like, no, this is actually a crisis that, this is going to be born. This is going to be foisted upon Oakland residents and taxpayers for a very long time that might be difficult to unwind. But could you talk a little bit about it?
Yeah. Well, so for those who don't know what the fuck we're talking about, because we're getting pretty local here, the A's left Oakland, just had their last season, and so Oakland has no more professional sports teams left, and the city is selling the Coliseum, its ownership stake in the Coliseum, and they sold for like $120 million or something to like a black entertainment group. It was a big deal, and like Sheng Tao was trumping his way that they were going to close up the fiscal deficit, which is structural. So it's that it's a one-time thing. So it actually doesn't address the problem at all in the long run. But nevertheless, this was what she was campaigning on. And then it turns out, and I haven't been following the details super specifically, so I may be getting some of this wrong, but my understanding is that the deal, upon closer inspection, looks much worse than what it was sold as. One of the details being that the buyer is allowed to back out of the deal and get their deposit back, made whole, on November 6th, the day after the election, which would indicate the whole thing is fake, just to fight the recall.
Oh wow! So she can have a win.
Yeah.
Or at least
so I mean, it's almost boring how ridiculous politics are in Oakland. There's just a story from Emily Ragusa, who's the really great journalist for the Berkeley Scanner, the other day, about how Pamela Price was extorting Mario Juarez
allegedly,
for $25,000. Allegedly extorting him for $25,000. Mario Juarez, for almost everybody who's listening to this will not be familiar with who this guy is. He's at the center of the FBI investigation that had resulted in a raid of the mayor Sheng Tao's house. He claims, with it looked like some credibility, that there was an assassination attempt on him, I think a year ago. So this is like, I mean, it gets to a level of like Gotham City ridiculousness where it's not even interesting anymore because it's just so absurd. But that's Oakland politics.
Yeah, I wanted to talk a little bit about San Francisco, but it just everything pales in comparison to the East Bay. So not not quite as interesting. I don't know. I was writing about the mission in San Francisco and how the forces of gentrification have kind of won, but they're still doing their thing. They're still
Hmm.
fighting housing. They're still fighting new businesses. They're still like fighting for a moratorium on new things. And it's like, you guys won. Every block in the mission has empty storefronts. There's these
Your
lots that
vision has become true.
yeah, they've good job. There's no gentrification. There's like
Yeah.
these lots with no homes. And after I wrote this story, some people pointed out to me, it's like, oh yeah, this is so long running. They sent me some flyers from the 90s from an anarchist group that was like, smash beauty bars, smash
I remember that.
blowfish sushi. If you
Yeah.
see a Lexus or you see a nice car, smash its windows. And it's such vintage, like Gen X, no offense,
Hmm.
Leighton, anarchism.
Yeah, totally.
um, it's like it's like some kind of like office space. Work sucks. You're caught in the
Right.
matrix. All economic growth is evil. It's like, yeah, I don't think anyone wants to live in big box, Target, McDonald's, shopping mall cities. No one wants that. But this idea that all economic growth, whether it's a corner store or, you know, any kind of housing, represents a form of evil that needs to be attacked violently.
Right.
It's
Right.
like these ideas have already run its course. The fact that people still believe in them after they've seen what it's done to so many cities, this
I just have a
disinvestment's
question,
crazy.
like from the perspective of these activists, what are you to do if you are, say, a college educated white person without inherited wealth? So, you're getting by on your own labor, but you're college educated, so you're professional class. You're going to get some kind of an okay salary, but not enough to move to the suburbs in California where housing is it's just absurdly high. You're going to be a renter. Where are you supposed to go? Because, like, is the message that you should move out to the white suburbs? Like, is the
Yeah.
message like straight up racial segregation and embracing white flight, of which used to be considered deeply racist in the 80s and the 90s? Like, that white people need to go to white neighborhoods and not be in these city centers? Because, I mean, there's a practical reason people live in these
No,
neighborhoods.
what you have to understand, Leighton, is that these parts of San Francisco and the Mission that were built by Scandinavian and German immigrants, this is now, and Irish immigrants, this is now
Hmm.
Latino only territory. And
Right.
if you move in and you're any other skin color,
Right.
there's a uh, skin color check. You're a gentrifier. Now, if you're a wealthy person from LA who happens to be the right race and you move in, oh no, you're a local.
By the way, how reflective do you think that sentiment is among normal Latino people in the mission? Because I remember in LA, there's the same thing over Boyle Heights, gentrification in Boyle Heights. First of all, there were a lot of people in Boyle Heights who were very happy with the gentrification. People like Latino families who'd been there for many years, obviously, because first of all, their housing prices were going way up. So if you're a homeowner, that's great for you. But also, it was like, nice restaurants and cafes to go to. It makes everybody happy. But then also a lot of the developers themselves were Latinos from LA, and then that's where this term "gentification" came from.
Mm.
Like la gente, these are gentrifiers. That means you are from la gente, but you're complicit in gentrification. And I'm like, okay, so is it really a white Latino split, or is it just a ultra left versus normie split?
It's definitely the latter. I think the average Latino, white, black, whatever resident of any major neighborhood in San Francisco does not give a fuck about
Right.
any of these demands. But we've got this kind of fairly influential activist class, many of them funded by taxpayer dollars, funded by the city, that are not elected. There's no, they prance around, talk about democracy, but no one elected them to represent these communities.
Hmm.
And they exert incredible amounts of influence at these kind of zoning meetings, at the city council, at everything where they can kind of uh, obstruct the process to block new restaurants or new
They're
housing.
lobbyists. They're like ideological
They're
lobbyists.
ideological lobbies. Very few of them. I've talked to local bar owners and restaurant owners who are who get intimidated by them, but then they're like, well, no one likes them, but they keep showing up, and they've got good funding. It's like the city's kind of captured by these extremists, again funded by taxpayer dollars, and it's just the dichotomy is crazy in that so many immigrants, young people, white people come to San Francisco with just an idea, with a little bit of training in some kind of technical field, and they invent all kinds of new companies and concepts that change the way the world works. It's this center for innovation. And then we've got this like old school Tammany Hall political machine that just strangles all growth. But at least Tammany Hall provided police officers and garbage men. These are just like NGO ghouls who don't really do anything except for like maybe they'll do like a block
party. Creating jobs provided jobs for workers, and this machine provides jobs for professionals.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I think we need to wrap it up in a second. It's been about 50 minutes.
Sure, we can wrap it up, or we can zoom out to the global stuff, but I'm fine with either.
Let's get to that if there is number 2, because that deserves its own like whole discussion.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So we have not figured out a way to wrap this up. We don't have a see you in hell or whatever tagline to go throw to. That's the Red Scares. So any suggestions? Make it a tradition.
I don't know. You're putting me on the spot. I think we need to workshop that a little bit.
Okay. Right. Talk to you soon.